Welcome everybody, and welcome to this joint BDB Pitmans, DWD and Copper webinar, which is called the Energy Security Strategy. Does it help or hinder our net zero drive? My name is Richard Marsh. I'm a partner in BDB Pitmans Planning and Infrastructure team, and I will be chairing today's session. The webinar will dive into the detail and implications of the newly published British Energy Security Strategy and consider whether the strategy is ambitious enough to put the UK in the best possible position to reach net zero by 2050. Now, today on what is Earth Day, we're joined by a stellar group of energy experts. We've got Ross Greer, MD of Next Energy Capital, Carly Vince from EDF, Paul Rees from SSE Energy Solutions, Sarah Price from DWD Planning Consultants, and Sam Cranston from Copper. So each panelist will introduce themselves and speak for a couple of minutes to discuss themselves, their company, and provide a couple of initial thoughts on aspects of the strategy that may be relevant to them or their company. I'll then act as a chair for a panel discussion on the key webinar themes, and we'll end with an audience Q&A session. So please do submit any questions you may have via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, rather than the chat box. Now, you do have an option to ask questions anonymously, so I won't embarrass anyone. And also, if you do have any technical issues during the webinar, then please use the chat box function for that rather than Q&A, and my colleague Millie will endeavour to help you. So on April 7th, not too long ago, just before Easter, the government published its eagerly anticipated energy security strategy in response to recent soaring energy prices and the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Now, the strategy seeks to supercharge the rollout of clean energy infrastructure to help the UK reach 95% low carbon electricity by 2030. But at the same time, the strategy also supports the maximisation of North Sea oil and gas extraction. The document sets out some more ambitious clean energy deployment targets and promises changes on consenting issues to speed up the planning process for offshore wind farms in particular, and provide greater policy support for solar schemes. But the strategy doesn't offer much hope, at present at least, for major deployment of onshore wind projects and tidal schemes, nor does it provide much comfort to consumers that energy bills will stop rising in the near future, nor that the government is taking action to decarbonise domestic heating. Now, the recently published IPCC report was absolutely clear in calling for drastic cuts in fossil fuel consumption, widespread electrification and improved energy efficiency in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So is the strategy ambitious enough in order to put the UK in the best possible position to reach net zero by 2050? So without further ado, I will now introduce our first panelist, and that is Ross Greer. So Ross is the Managing Director of Next Energy Capital, and he oversees and is a member of the investment committee on the Next Energy Solar Fund and also Next Power UK ESG Fund. He's joined NEC in 2013 and has led the M&A team to deploy over £1 billion of assets, delivered 860 megawatts of transactions on 90 deals to the fund. And overall, Ross has seen the development of more than 1 gigawatt of UK solar and battery storage projects. So Ross, it's over to you.
Morning, thank you, Richard. Morning, everybody. I guess slightly more context on Next Energy as well. So we've got around $4 billion worth of assets under management, predominantly solar and storage across the globe. 3 key pillars to our organisation. We have a development arm that again develops internationally, but has a significant pipeline of post-subsidy solar in the UK and also of utility scale battery in the UK, amounting to more than 1.5 gigawatts. We also develop in other international jurisdictions as well through that vehicle. We have a fund management vehicle, which you've spoken to already. Critically there, we run around 1 gigawatt now of utility scale PV and also battery storage on the UK network. And again, we have significant growth ambitions in the post-subsidy solar space. We've built some of the key post-subsidy solar assets that are operational in the UK space. So we're well wired into how we think solar is going to grow over the next decade in the UK space as well. Final pillar of our organization is an asset management sister company. So we look at the entire value chain of solar end to end, and we're a long-term holder of assets as well. So very key to us how all of energy strategy comes together. Couple of key kind of takeaways from the strategy from my perspective. Number one, I guess solar got a mention. In historic times, you know, been in the industry for more than a decade, we've struggled for solar to have an angle in many conversations. At least it now has a decent foot at the table. I think, again, thinking positively, at least we have a strategy, at least it builds on momentum for net zero and you know, any momentum we got from COP26. On a negative side, I guess we were looking for a little bit more. We were hoping for more kind of tangible stretch targets around solar. There's a notable absence around battery storage. And from my perspective, we were hoping it would be used as an opportunity to tidy some of the pieces up around the fringes of grid connections and also around the planning process for you know, onshore technologies like solar and wind as well. So I feel they could have gone significantly further there. On a personal note as well, I would have liked to have seen some commitments around energy efficiency, given the fact that that really is a pretty large emission from our whole decarbonisation effort as a country at the moment.
Thanks, Ross. That was a helpful intro. So now I will introduce Carly Vince. Now, Carly is Chief Planning Officer at EDF and has over 15 years experience in planning and development. She leads the planning and land teams responsible for delivering the powers on the Sizewell C nuclear power station project. And she's also involved in historical work on the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station, which I think is the largest development site in Europe presently. She also works on various EDF renewables projects, and that includes the Longfield Solar DCO project, which has recently been accepted by PINS for examination. So Carly, it's over to you.
Good morning, thank you. So EDF strongly welcome the strategy, and I think we're incredibly proud that the Prime Minister chose the Hinkley Point C project as the place to unveil the strategy. I think it's a clear demonstration that nuclear is at the heart of the strategy, and it underpins the importance of Sizewell C and also an extension of Sizewell B generating life in the future. So a combination of the Hinkley C, Sizewell B and C have the ability to deliver low carbon for 15 million homes, which is a significant proportion of the energy that we're looking to generate. But this strategy underpins essentially what we all know. It's about a blend, and so as Ross mentioned, seeing solar mentioned in sort of strong recognition, but also the newer technology, so the rainbow colour of hydrogen that seems to be growing by the day is mentioned, and EDF have ambitions to develop that not only in connection with Sizewell C, but also across a number of sites. So it's all really positive from our perspective. But what the strategy doesn't do is is give a signal to what we all need to actually deliver this on the ground. We need a sound, up-to-date suite of national policy statements. We need stability in terms of what developers need to do. I understand there's around 50 consultations that have all closed, but with no certainty as to what they're actually going to ask developers. We've recently been consulted on biodiversity net gain, but also at the same time nature recovery. There's a lot of overlap potentially, and it's very unclear for developers what they truly need to deliver. So as well as this positivity about what needs to be done. There needs to be some recognition about actually how we deliver projects on the ground.
That's great. Thanks for that, Carly. I'm sure we'll come on to some of those points during the panel discussion. So now it's on to Paul Rees. So Paul's the Director of Energy Infrastructure within the Energy Solutions business of SSE. He's responsible for delivering net zero carbon solutions across UK and Ireland, which includes solar battery storage, EV heat decarbonisation, and the enhancement of electrical networks. And before SSE, Paul had senior roles within large international services and construction businesses. At this point, I will hand over to Paul to introduce himself and a couple of thoughts on the strategy.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Richard. Yeah, same sort of comments really as others so far. At SSE, we certainly welcome the strategy. We see it as an ambitious, it's a once in a generation opportunity to sort of set out an orderly transition to net zero for the UK. I think we were excited to see some of the increased ambitions, certainly around the offshore area. The increase there significantly ramps up from previous increases that we've seen, and recognising we think that's certainly the backbone to a clean energy future for all of us. Interestingly, we're also pleased to see other areas of call out around flexible storage technologies, pump storage. I think as others have already talked about, certainly the increase in solar was welcome. We're looking to do large utility scale, front of the meter storage and solar opportunities. So we welcome that. I think at the planning issues that Carly alluded to, I think we will interestingly to see the detail when that comes out as well. That's very important. I think the challenges there for all of us around supply chain, I know we'll come on to as well. I think other areas for us that we saw that were of interest and development, certainly the hydrogen side, we're doing that in a small scale within certain parts of our group as well. Certainly from the distributed energy side, the decarbonisation of heat, we would have probably liked to seen a little bit more around that, around district heating schemes and how that comes together and the approach to support that, but recognising this was really around a energy security strategy for sort of the medium term. From a personal perspective, I'd pick up on Ross's comments earlier as well. The energy efficiency seemed to have been missed out there in terms of the requirements, and that's certainly an easier way and maybe more of a short-term way to manage the energy efficiencies, and we would have liked to have seen, personally would have liked to have seen that in. I think generally there's some exciting areas of opportunity for all of us, and I'm sure we'll cover those off as we go through the webinar this morning.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Paul. So now I will introduce Sarah Price. Sarah is a partner at DWD, Property and Planning Consultants, and has particular expertise in providing strategic planning advice on large-scale energy projects, particularly those within the DCO regime. She's currently leading on the planning aspects of the Mallard Pass solar farm for Windell, and has provided planning advice on a number of high-profile solar, nuclear and wind projects, including Bradwell B, Hinkley Point C, Wilver and the Walney extension. So Sarah, it's over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Richard, and good morning, everybody. So yes, as Richard said, I've been lucky to work across a wide range of renewable energy and low carbon projects. So from nuclear to solar to offshore wind, and I am really excited about delivering this next range of projects that can really, as others have alluded to, do what we need to do as an industry to deliver what's a once in a generation, I think, as Paul said, opportunity. As a practice, we've been involved in many DCOs, but of the energy ones, 12 DCO projects, and we're also involved in lots of sub 50 megawatt solar projects as well. So we've worked on over 50 of those. So we're seeing sort of how these projects are going through the consenting process, and we'll talk more about those, I think, as we come to the panel discussion. I'm really positive about the strategy, as others are as well, but I think as other panelists have commented on, it's all about the detail. I think we were hoping sort of perhaps optimistically that some of the intentions that were coming out through the various media briefings before the energy strategy would mean that we might have something more akin to the Nightingale Hospital rollout that we had from COVID, and it clearly falls way short of that. I do want to be positive though, but I think it's also important to look at the scale of what needs to be achieved. I talked a bit about this last time we had one of these seminars around COP26, and just looking at solar, for instance, we would need 160 350 megawatt solar farms by 2035 to reach the target that's in there. And clearly solar will come from smaller schemes, some on rooftops, probably not much, and we can come to that later. But that would mean around about 12 every year. And we've got a lot coming through at the moment, but to really achieve that ambition as an industry, we've got a lot to do. And I think as the government policy, as Carly said, what's most important is certainty, and knowing when you come to examination on DCOs and when you come to committee meetings on smaller projects, that you've got that certainty that the policy is behind you. And clearly there would always need to be a proper examination of issues, but having that really firm basis is what's most important. And again, when we come to the panel discussion, maybe we can talk about areas that the detail can be developed to help that. Just the final point I wanted to make was around some of the references that have come in the strategy to brownfield land, for instance. And we all know when we're delivering these sort of scale projects that it's very difficult to achieve that on brownfield land. Brownfield land needs to do a lot in terms of housing delivery, employment delivery. We haven't actually got all that much of it. So when we're looking at these projects, solar in particular as well, where the reference comes, I think that it's really important that when the draft MPSs come to fruition, that they are very clear on what the government policy is on that, which is hopefully the direction it's been going already, recognising that to deliver at this sort of scale, it's not going to be possible to do that on brownfield land, and a recognition that that's not the predominant factor in the site selection process, which is not quite what comes out in the energy strategy. And we're already seeing on projects that that's being slightly used by objectors to try and resist projects. And it's important that objectors have their say, absolutely, but also that certainty is there. So thank you. Interested to join the discussion.
Thanks, Sarah. We will definitely pick up on that particular point. So onto our final panelist, who is Sam Cranston. Sam's a director of energy infrastructure at Copper Consultancy, and works in comms and engagement, and has a particular specialism in planning and infrastructure, and in particular in energy infrastructure. He's currently leading the comms work on a number of energy DCO projects, including solar, offshore wind, hydrogen, and electricity transmission, where he provides strategic comms and stakeholder advice. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Good morning, everyone. A quick intro to Copper. We're a specialist communications, engagement, and consultation consultancy, as we support clients across a range of complex and high-profile infrastructure projects across the UK, including over 40 DCOs to date. In energy, specifically, as you mentioned there, Richard, we support developers in offshore wind in England, Wales, and Scotland, solar, hydrogen, nuclear, and transmission and storage. In terms of my reflections on the energy strategy, I agree with a lot of what's been said by the panel so far. I think it was clear that the UK needed an updated approach to energy, especially in light of the war in Ukraine, COP26, and the rising prices of energy. So on the whole, it was definitely refreshing to see the government being bold in its ambitions for building a homegrown power supply, and the increased targets for offshore wind, solar, hydrogen, and nuclear were certainly welcome. Like others, however, it was disappointing not to see commitment to bringing back onshore wind in England. And although the cabinet wrangling was well publicised before the strategy was published, it was still a bit of a shock to see where the language actually ended up. And I know we'll touch on this a bit more later. I think the other point to mention, again, we can touch on this more later, but from what we see, there is clear that there is overwhelming public support for the deployment of renewable energy. We know from Copper's own research that the majority of people would support onshore projects near them to improve our own energy security. However, the detail in the strategy provided more questions than answers as to how we actually go about speeding up the deployment of these technologies. So yeah, very much looking forward to the discussions with yourself and others this morning.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Sam. So we'll now dive into the discussion. So we'll run through the key themes, and the first one is on sort of general support within the strategy for, in particular, solar, onshore wind, nuclear and hydrogen. So the question is, does the strategy go far enough on those particular aspects? Now, I think the first point that's been noticed is there are increased deployment targets generally across those various technologies. So we've got 24 gigawatts for civil nuclear by 2050, an increase of 10 gigawatts for offshore wind by 2030, a 70 gigawatt ambition for solar by 2035, and a doubling of hydrogen capacity to 10 gigawatts. So the question to the panelists, do those targets actually matter? Do they mean anything? And are they in some cases too ambitious? Ross, I'll start with you on that one.
Great question. And do they matter? So I think yes and no is the honest answer as to whether they matter. So I think firmly setting ambition in the political sphere is really important in achieving the goals that are set out, and I think they fell short of doing that robustly in the solar space. I think it could have gone further. It could have trickled down, therefore, into planning policy and into society in a way that enabled the delivery, as opposed to just assume the industry would sort it out. So solar as a business is particularly robust and flexible, and it's had a lot of kickings in the 10 years that I've worked in it, with kind of removal of subsidy in overly aggressive fashions and kind of start-stop mentality and various other political influences, and the industry has always found a way to continue to grow. It has significant growth ambitions already, prior to the strategy coming online, where you're seeing kind of 30-40 gigawatts of planning at the very top of the funnel at the moment. And therefore, it is well placed to do an awful lot of what is built into the energy strategy already. I think it becomes increasingly more challenging to get towards the top of that goal for all of the technology types, and that's really where the rubber will hit the road, and where we're really hoping things like the FSO come into their own in enabling grid connections, and also where planning policy will need to come to the fore to drive these projects through the process. So yes, we understand the need for communities to engage with projects, but it is not going to be feasible for everybody to be super happy about what's on their doorstep. We are going to have some difficult conversations, and the industry needs to work its way through that. I think we're starting to see some of those emerge in solar. We haven't really seen them for the last few years. It's been relatively straightforward as a developer to find pretty uncontentious sites, but I think as the development community has kind of driven more volume back into the solar space, we are starting to see more challenging pieces of land being taken through. We are seeing those larger scale projects come through the process as well. So look, I think it's a bit of a political answer from me as to whether I think they're important. So yeah, I do think that they missed a trick by being able to really set that ambition firmly. But I also think our industry is really good at getting to scale anyway. So I do believe we have a unique opportunity in the solar space. I think as well, from a solar perspective, one of the interesting points that I think Carly made earlier was what's important here is a mix, right? And all of us around this table believe that there should be a mix. There is no one type of technology that solves this problem for all of us. I think solar is really well placed because it is, very easy to take a project from concept through to energization in a relatively short period of time in the solar space. It is really well placed to mop up where some of these other kind of longer technologies find it difficult to realize the top end of their ambitions there as well. So I see a really rich seam of solar potential over the next 10-15 years as the industry continues to evolve.
Thanks, Ross. And then seeing the projects coming through the DCO regime, it's there are going to be a hefty number in the next couple of years. It's almost as if the government said, "You guys know what you're doing, just get on and deliver." I'm sure that's not quite true, but
you often don't get mentioned in the solar space, right? There's always a lot of talk about offshore wind. There's always a lot of contentious discussion around onshore, as we all know. Solar is always the forgotten child in the political sphere. In my honest opinion, I think we're at that point now where we're delivering on a post-subsidy basis in scale already. We have got CFD coming to the space as well to drive more volume, but actually solar is already standing on its own 2 feet without the subsidy. We see significant volumes of corporates coming to the space to drive their own decarbonisation agendas, and therefore a rich seam of corporate PPA opportunity out there as well. So there's a whole load of positives that are driving the commercialization of the solar industry further, which will allow us to continue to grow despite whatever political changes happen in that space as well. So I think again, solar is uniquely placed because it doesn't have such significant lead times, and therefore we don't necessarily need that same level of stability as, say, a nuclear plant does, where you really do need 10-15 years worth of absolute stability and belief that you're doing the right thing in order to get from kind of concept through to first energization.
That's great. Thanks, Ross. And Carly, on the nuclear target of 24 gigawatts, so 3 times the current amount by 2050, do you feel that's realistic? Do you feel the various measures that have been put forward in the new nuclear body should help speed up deployment?
Sorry, school yes, I think it's helpful that it reinforces the commitment to nuclear. I think it will help other players in the market have that confidence to come forward now, because as we all know, EDF are developing Hinkley and hopefully Sizewell, but there aren't many others actively promoting at the moment, and we need that to change. We need the supply chain to gear up. We need the delivery teams to have the right expertise, and by having a number of players, that all helps to play its part. But it does take a long time for the DCO regime to deliver these projects. So Hinkley took 3 to 4 years, and Sizewell has taken much longer. It is, as Sarah said, really important that communities have their opportunity to comment and shape the proposals. But as we're seeing, not only in nuclear, but all of the technologies, it is taking much more time. And we're in an energy crisis. We're from an environmental perspective, we know we're at the sort of tipping point where we need to move forward quickly. So we've all got to work together to collectively play our part to actually speed up delivery. And actually, I think where there's greatest opportunity is at the front end in that project readiness. We see already the engineers, being able to deploy quite quickly. They understand the projects, they can get on site relatively quickly. So now it's how do we deal with the front end.
Thanks, Carly. And Sarah, on the offshore wind target, for example, there's been a lot of talk about 40 gigawatts being optimistic. It's now 50 gigawatts. The government hasn't made a decision on a wind DCO project since 2015 on time. we'll come on to planning reform in further detail, but is 50 gigawatts just completely unrealistic? Should we lower expectations and keep them at 40?
Well, I mean, I think the sort of more general point to say is whether these are actually targets and how they'll be used, as Ross was alluding to. They're stated as ambitions, and of course it's only useful having those ambitions if the government are going to do something, A, to help industry realise those, and B, to ensure that they're material considerations in planning decisions. So what we're, sorry, I know you asked a question about offshore wind, but what we're finding in terms of scale, possibly mostly for solar, I don't mean to just focus on that, is that because large scale projects are needed, as well as all of the small scale ones and other technologies as well, is that we need to be able to have some targets, policy-based targets in place to be able to explain why this sort of scale of development is needed, because not to impose them on communities, but to ensure that that basis is there to work with communities as well, and ensure that they understand, both communities themselves and also their representatives, that sort of scale is needed. I mean, in terms of actually whether the offshore wind industry is able to deliver that additional gigawatts, I think it's much more how that's going to be achieved from a consenting process. And you mentioned that we'll talk about planning reform later, than it is about delivery. From what I know of the offshore wind operators, there's a lot of ambition to be able to meet those, and I'm sure that they will be able to step up to meet those targets. It's the environmental issues that come with offshore wind that I know, and others from working on them, takes a lot to work through with bodies such as, you know, Natural England, Environment Agency, MMO, etc. And it's that I'm really interested in. And the government alludes in the energy strategy to the possibility of a strategic level environmental review. What's again most important, and coming back to the point of certainty, is that promoters have the certainty that they then won't, well, firstly, that they'll be able to work with statutory consultees to be able to address those points in a shorter timescale. But secondly, that there won't be any JR risk associated with that. I mean, you can never obviously entirely remove JR risk, but I can see that the issue might be is that, as we all know, you need to, projects of this scale and complexity need to be worked carefully through, and where there are uncertainties, it just adds time. And as responsible promoters, developers will want to be working through those points in detail, or to have confidence they've already been addressed. And at the moment, I don't mean to sound negative about it, but I can't quite see how that's going to be achieved. It would be lovely if it could be, but there's no detail at all in the energy strategy how that will be achieved.
Absolutely. And Sarah, I mean, you mentioned earlier the on solar in particular, the obviously a preference for avoiding greenfield land and high quality agricultural land, and that previously developed land should be favoured, which I think there's a real tension there between that and a 70 gigawatt ambition. So it's really acknowledging as the sort of low hanging fruit sites get taken up, and the issues of grid connection capacity get worse, or potentially worse. How can solar developers avoid high quality land?
Yes, as you say, Richard, I mean, I think that I'm not sure of the origins of how that's come into the security strategy, and it might be to try and address concerns across conservative rural areas as to where these sites are coming forward. But I think the point is that given grid connection opportunities, the need to make the most of those, the fact that there aren't large sites in urban areas that are coming forward for this sort of technology. And actually, I would say that probably people living within those areas might have the same concerns that people living in other areas might have in terms of proximity to technology. And I should say, I don't think that those concerns are necessarily accurate. I think there's a lot that we need to do to help explain the actual effect of projects, solar, wind, and the fact that they can sit very comfortably with areas that people live in as well. But the areas that projects are coming forward, there's a large amount in Lincolnshire at the moment, for instance. Lincolnshire doesn't have a lot of brownfield land, and it's interesting to see whether from the strategy the government's saying, oh, you should be looking at other areas of the country with more brownfield land. I don't think it is, probably, but there is that tension there between what the security strategy is saying and actually what the draft MPSs are saying, which is I think much clearer in terms of what the government expects and also much more realistic.
Maybe I can add some to that as well, Richard, if it's helpful.
So go for it, Paul.
Totally agree with with what Sarah's said. I think a good question from the crowd as well on Wales as well. So interesting things going on in Wales at the moment, where the government is very focused on what they're calling kind of best and most valuable land. We've actually built our largest, and actually the UK's largest solar farm in Wales. So we know intricately how the government approaches use of land down there, and I think they're at really interesting inflection point. So what I guess we are seeing in that environment is the significant amounts of paranoia around land use into the future. So I see that Wales has some significant challenges at the moment. So big corporates are coming in and buying up tracts of farmland in order to do, forestation projects and shoot for carbon credits and various other complicated things that are taking farmland out of the farming cycle. I guess they see us in the same bag as that when they're thinking about how they manage landscape out into the future. So I think they are right to have a degree of concern about how land is being used, but I think they're absolutely missing a trick in being a real source of energy generation for the future. I think quietly they've taken a big roll of the dice on how tidal lagoon projects are going to come through the process and supply volumes of power and jobs and so on into the space. And I think they genuinely have missed a significant opportunity to support decently selected renewable projects at significant scale in areas that really do need it, and we can bring significant benefit from that perspective. When I look more broadly to the UK space as well, I think we are a little slow as a business in solar about talking around all the positives. So solar is really unique in its ability to protect biodiversity. It's something that I've spent an awful lot of my career trying to educate, the rest of industry peers and also wider community around. We are really unique in that we take, big plots of land out of the agricultural intensive farming cycle, and we set them aside with controlled traffic for long periods of time. There are no other plots of land in the UK, save for maybe some of the MOD land, that ticks that same box. We can do really unique things, and actually what we don't do as an industry is sell that benefit clearly to the communities in which we operate. So there are emerging case studies which are fascinating in the net gain space, where you're able to reduce the amount of pesticide on surrounding farmland because of the ecosystem services that a solar farm is able to provide. We need to harness these, we need to share these case studies, we need to build on them, and we need to be super robust in the way in which we're deploying those net gain measures out into the future. And it's not just lip service anymore, right? It's a key component of what we're shooting to deliver as an industry, and it's vital that we really do adopt the standard metrics. So metric 2.0 that Natural England's produced, I think they've just come out with 3.1 today. So as that metric continues to improve, and as we start to really understand science-based targets for things like net gain, we really need to drive them through every single development, and we need to consistently give that message to society that we are a really good neighbour and valuable neighbour from their perspective. I think we're a little bit slow as well in adopting newest forms of technology as well. You see agrivoltaics really advancing in other countries. We're not really seeing that in the UK space yet. I think it will come in the future. But certainly we need to continue to evolve our thinking around how solar fits into the ecosystem in order to continue to drive forward to meet those ambitions.
So on agrivoltaics, why do you think we're slow in taking that up? And do you think some of the decisions in Wales, for example, may prompt a push for more of that sort of co-location and appreciation that agriculture can coexist?
So I guess we're a little bit slow at the moment because we're still quite early on in the new development generation of solar. So development in the UK space effectively stalled at the end of the ROCs and has come back to life again over the last 18, 24 months with absolute fervor. But really that's not long enough for everyone to get past let's do solar in the traditional way. So everyone's piled in to do solar in the traditional way, then we're going for solar plus storage, because actually there is a better way for us to think about these energy generating stations than just doing traditional solar. So it will come, I think, is the honest answer in that. And as we see those case studies emerging from other jurisdictions, solar is very transferable from one jurisdiction to another. So we will take the best bits of those plants. We will build them ultimately through into the UK space. But as markets ramp up, obviously from an M&A perspective, simplicity is where the deals get done, isn't it? So the early next wave of solar is super simple post subsidy. It gets more complex as you bring energy storage into the space, but the industry and the finance industry particularly is dealing very well with adopting that combination. And then I think it then evolves into more interesting energy generating stations, and that's everything from agrivoltaics to generating green hydrogen and all sorts of more complicated energy hub solutions.
Thanks, Ross. So moving from solar to nuclear, or back to nuclear. So we mentioned the 24 gigawatts target, Carly, which is 3 times more than the current capacity. Now, bearing in mind the cost of nuclear relative to wind and solar and the time it takes for nuclear projects to become operational, is it right that we're strongly supporting more nuclear deployment?
Absolutely, you need a baseline. So the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, as we all know and love about the UK. Hinkley will be capable of generating 3.2 gigawatts. That is substantial. And I think it's probably worth, sorry to cut across, but I think it's probably worth considering that in the context of the SMRs, which are a really important feature of the nuclear strategy. Hinkley will, 3.2 gigawatts, that's 7 or 8 SMR sites, so they can completely coexist, but there is a benefit of nuclear at scale. Particularly because it's a proven technology. Hinkley has already gone through the generic design assessment process. We know that takes a long time, as long as the DCO consenting regime, and also building up the supply chain network. These big projects do take a long time to get off the ground, but once you do get them off the ground, they can be rolled out. So you can have that fleet effect, and as we will see through Sizewell, that will drive down cost, that will drive down or give further certainty over cost and timescales. So there is a real benefit of large nuclear. It's a proven, mature technology. We have a good idea of cost, and it's really important for communities and other stakeholders, as well as meeting the strategy, that they do have confidence in things being delivered and how they will be delivered on site. So for me, it's not a question of pitting one against each other. There is room, as we can see from the ambitions in terms of scale and also the criticality of delivering this, for everyone to sort of coexist quite happily. And I think one thing that we could all get better at as an industry is actually looking at how do we start to co-locate some of these critical infrastructure, be that hydrogen and nuclear, be that, I don't know, SMRs and conventional large-scale nuclear. I don't think there's a limit to, we shouldn't be putting a limit as to what can be achieved.
Thanks, Carly. Sam, Paul, did you have anything to add, anything further to add on specific targets?
I think the sort of, on the target point, it's certainly on the offshore side, the supply chains challenges are there, are going to be there in terms of delivery, but the sponsors and people like ourselves, are investing to set up and deliver those, increased growth. I think the industry can deliver that. I think the challenges around planning people have talked about are absolutely the key ones around getting access to getting those processes. I think the other bit that I know we'll come on to talk about is the role of the new FSO in all of this, in bringing this together, and grid connections, because this is all very good, but unless we can connect it to the grid, unless it's actually integrated, we're all going to fall over very quickly. I think that's, we'd certainly like to see more detail about how that's going to work, because what was pleasing to see, they're talking about a whole systems approach. But how is that now going to get translated in terms of either allocation of projects in certain locations, saying that in certain parts of the grid connections, they'd rather be seeing a battery project rather than a solar or a combined, or how that integrates with bringing wind onshore in terms of major interconnections. So there's a really very challenging piece, I think, for the FSO around that whole piece of planning its role with National Grid and the connections. So I think how all of that works, do we start to see an allocation of projects, timings linked to planning processes as well? So you've almost got a sort of areas of development that they can start articulating from a country perspective, where there are places, we know certain regions have already got capacity constraints. How is that going to be addressed? We're talking about regional distributed pricings now coming out in the way this comes out as well. So I think that's, to me, is the other key element here, is that role of the FSO, because grid is incredibly challenged for everybody, as we all know. If you're making a grid application at the moment and you're trying to work your way through it, trying to get certainty around that timing and the applications around that, it is a challenge. And what we've just done is increase that exponentially in terms of the number. So it comes back to, within all the organisations, the ambition's there, but everyone's got to gear up to be able to deliver that ambition. So grid have got to gear up in terms of being able to process applications, very practical perspective, and deal with them, technical compliance piece around it, as well as the FSO giving that guidance around where they see it. I think is otherwise we'll find great ambition, but our ability to deliver it is going to be significantly hindered.
That's great, thanks, Paul. Sam, did you have anything further to add?
Yeah, I think just
targets.
On a couple of the points there. I think you sort of mentioned at the top there, Richard, about do they matter? I think from a public perspective, I think they are important, because they show that there is a commitment to targets or ambitions in technology. I think the detail, as we've discussed, is really important in how that gets deployed. We've seen that there is clearly public support for rolling out renewable energy across the UK, and people are willing to accept projects close to them, and we see that from the data. Clearly, it's important to have meaningful and open and upfront discussions with those communities who are going to host these projects in their local area. I think that would be really important. Touching on what Ross picked up on earlier, there are things to shout about, and solar in particular is one that there are huge benefits to come from these projects going forward, not just on delivering against net zero targets or delivering against energy security. There's much more to shout about, and I think there's much more to do on that front as well. I know industry bodies like Solar UK are doing a good job at the moment in sort of trying to push that message forward, working with the industry. So I think, I think those targets are important. We're going to talk about onshore wind and where that sort of ended up. But I think giving confidence both to developers to bring sites forward to hit those targets is one thing, but it also helps to bring people's mindsets into what we're aiming towards as well. As has been mentioned, I think by everybody, the devil there is in the detail about how that then gets rolled out. And I think that's where it can all fall down if there's not seen, and for the public, if it's not seen to be a collaborative approach to how all of these projects across all technologies are rolled out. If it's seen to be piecemeal, it becomes more challenging to accept, and more more unacceptable to people if they don't see that there's a coherent plan as to how all of these things are going to be rolled out. And I think, as Carly said, we all agree that a mix is important, but if everything seems to be competing and one thing not talking to the other, the messages become very mixed, and then you end up in a position where it becomes more and more difficult for people to accept that.
That's great, thanks, Sam. So now we'll move on to planning reform, and whether the proposals are sufficient. Now, there was a key, or the key aspects of planning reform within the strategy were related to offshore wind in particular, and a reference to decisions taking 4 years and a desire to cut that down to 1 year, which I think is slightly misleading. I think the reference there to 4 years was to the Norfolk Vanguard decision, which was both subject to a JR and then a subsequent redetermination. So total time of 3 years and 8 months, which is certainly not the norm for all offshore wind projects, and definitely not the norm for onshore projects. So clearly a desire to use project speed to create a quicker planning process is got to be welcomed. And the potential from September next year, subject to consultation, to introduce a fast track DCO process, I'm sure would be welcome for both offshore wind farms, but also for other technologies. And that simply wasn't mentioned in the strategy, but hopefully that will come forward for all. But question to everyone, but are the issues with delays to planners' decisions slightly overstated? And is it reasonable or feasible for DCO examination periods to be reduced, for example, from 6 months, and to reduce that overall period from submission of a DCO to decision from circa 17 months to 12 months? So are we going too far? Sarah.
Thanks, Richard. So I think that there are, as Carly alluded to earlier, there are a number of stages in the process that you can save time effectively, and actually, sorry, save time is probably the wrong word. I think it's do things more effectively to make sure that you're getting all the benefits of the DCO process in terms of upfront consultation and engagement, but that there's that level of certainty that you're not going to be stuck in a much longer process than is needed. And clearly the government have alluded to being able to shorten that for offshore wind. And it's, as you said, the timings are interesting when they talk about a year, what that actually means, because they talk later about the possibility of shortening the examination process, which then, as you said, goes into project speed and possibly other technologies as well. And I think certainly from my perspective, there are some technologies and some sites that you absolutely should be able to shorten the examination process for. And I think that solar probably presents one of those opportunities where that is possible, because while we're looking at large scale sites, I think the issues are relatively clear now, even though only 2 solar NSIPs have gone through examination. I think that that's certainly an example where there could be a shortened, more effective examination. I think the real key point will be how you can shorten the not necessarily the consultation periods, but that overall process of consultation, iteration, not just in relation to comments coming back from the local community, which are obviously hugely important that those are addressed properly, but also the statutory consultees. And we know that one of the many reasons that offshore wind has been extended in those early periods is engagement with statutory consultees around survey periods, for instance, and resolving issues prior to examination. So I think that that's probably one of the key areas that the government can look at. And they talk about, as I mentioned earlier, a perhaps strategic response to those. I'd be interested in how that strategic level appraisal or whatever they're proposing may be carried out to enable that to be shorter, as we said, whilst ensuring that promoters have certainty over the proper process, or rather that the proper process has been through, to avoid the risk of that being challenged later by others. So I think that that's probably some of the challenges around it. The positive thing is that I'm sure that there is the possibility to improve it. I think also probably what we should go back to is the DCO process is already supposed to be a streamlined process. It's not clearly always coming out that way, but that's how it was designed and intended. And I think perhaps from my perspective, it's more about making sure that the MPSs do their job properly and that the process does actually work as it was originally intended. Because we're already seeing that there certainly are DCOs and energy DCOs that can be prepared relatively quickly and submitted within, say, a sort of 18-month time period, possibly even shorter than that. Whereas we've got other previous experience of taking much longer to go through those processes. So I think it's about clearer guidance on that first part, and then clearer policy that gives promoters confidence that through going, if you're doing things effectively in the right way, that process can be speeded up, and the policy is there to ensure that the planning balance can weigh in favour for a project that should be consented.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And I was going to say, Carly, as someone who's gone through the DCO process on two very complicated projects, is it you move at 1,000 miles an hour, it's extremely busy.
I would not advocate speeding up the examination for a nuclear power station. It would break not only the developer, but also the statutory bodies and the planning inspectorate of which we rely, and also importantly the community. But having worked on probably one of the most easiest DCOs of West Burton Sea, where we didn't have any compulsory purchase powers being needed, the local authorities were either in support or neutral, and we had 20 interested parties still taking 6 months. I very much know that there is the potential to speed up, and so I think actually what we should be working with the planning inspectorate and other civil servants to develop almost like a criteria based approach as to which projects might qualify for a speeding up. And if you go through the process and it eventually translates that it does need 6 months, and then so be it, but let's try to explore the potential. And I completely agree with everything Sarah said. The only thing I would add is I think there's also the potential to speed up the judicial review period, because we are seeing more and more schemes being challenged for, I think in 2021 alone, and they're all taking a lot of time, many of those decisions being quashed and then redetermined. That isn't good for the sector, both from a planning profession, but also for delivering energy infrastructure. So we need to think about how do we speed those processes up as well. So it's almost like the front and the back end need some
or speed them up again. I mean, it wouldn't be a normal period if we weren't talking about planning reform and trying to sort out the JR process, which was simplified a few years back, but as you say, needs to be further streamlined to avoid that uncertainty. Okay, so coming on to the next
Maybe let me add a couple of words to that as well, Richard. Sorry to cut you off. So I think I've listened really intently to what everyone said. It's been really interesting. From the very highest perspective, we need to all believe there's an emergency that needs to be solved. And that cuts to the core of the points everybody was making about whether this is ambitious enough as a strategy, but what it influences is behaviors throughout everything that we do in realizing these projects. And that's everything from how efficient the planning process is to how consultees are rightly engaged within a process, but are also educated that we're trying to solve an emergency. So yes, if you've got a rightful objection, you should absolutely have the ability to play that card, and it should be heard. But we have to quash NIMBYism in this process, because it's not acceptable that you just, you don't accept it because you just don't like it for whatever, principled standpoint. You should be able, in my view, to see the energy generating facility that you're using, right? Gone are the days when you walk in your house and you flick a light switch on and it's your human right that the light comes on and you can afford it and you don't care where it comes from, and all the stuff that we've had over the last 20, 30 years. We need to get rid of that mentality. And I for one, I want to see that, right? I love looking at wind turbines. I think they look awesome, but I appreciate I'm in the minority, right? And I sadly do get super excited about seeing solar and other generating sets as well. But actually, when I talk to young people, and we do a lot of education visits, and the thing I really like about doing that is, in their mindset, it's the logical thing to do, right? You talk to them about solar from our perspective, which is, look, aren't we doing this great thing of transitioning the planet onto thing? And they're like, well, why wouldn't you do that? It's the obvious thing to do, right? So I think, our generation and maybe the generation behind us, we need to drive this forward with, panic in our eyes. Like, we need to save the planet. We need to do this. We therefore need to make planning efficiency. We need to take the quick wins. There's a few in the town and country planning act, in my view as well, around solar. So, for a long time we've been saying, clean up this 50 megawatt AC DC issue that the industry's been dealing with. Well, we've got a grid connection, we've got a viable piece of land. Let's maximize the power generation from it. It's just logical, right? Get that done. Get some CPO powers into the cable route process in Town and Country Planning Act as well, so we don't get extorted by a particular landowner or counterparty in that cable route, because they understand there's an emergency and they have to be engaged with that infrastructure. So, I think, I saw a really nice video from Quasi after the strategy was announced, where he was making all of these key points. He was making them really nicely and robustly, but then the message disappears, right? We don't consistently message that this is something that every single person in society needs to be concerned about for the future of the planet. And I think, it's a societal shift that is required for us to achieve a lot of the things that underpin whether we're going to be successful in achieving the targets.
Absolutely, Ross. I think go on.
Could I just, I just wanted to add to that, in the context of, I think there's also a backdrop at the moment where you've got an economic nudge that you can bring into it as well. Yes, you've got the sort of, I absolutely agree with Ross around the whole societal piece, and I think people, would recognise, hopefully, but I'd be really interested to see when they're talking about, for example, onshore wind now, they're talking about, if you are close to onshore wind, you may get some savings on your sort of fuel bill. Now, how that ultimately going to work is quite fragmented. We've got a structure. So, if you live within a certain geographical postcode, if your supplier, you can go to that. But that starts to make it real for people. It starts to actually make a real difference. And you've got the economic nudge now where that's possible. And I think, looking at that a little bit wider, what other energy sources could you bring into that as well? Could you play around? Could you do there? I think that's that backdrop at the moment with the, we all know the cost of living crisis and the energy problems that are associated with that as well. I think you do looking at some creative ways around policy and development around that. So if you are local, how do you get the benefits of that as well in terms of that element? I think that has to be looked at as well, because I think it's a key opportunity that we won't have that opportunity again.
Yep, absolutely, Paul. And it took a war in our continent to bring this about. People recognise that. People support onshore wind. So I think there was an Octopus Energy survey that came out with 87% support for onshore wind. But then if it happens in your backyard, then you're definitely opposed to it. So hopefully the possibility of reduced energy bills should then sway people back to what is right. And I think at this point, it's probably a good time to bring in Sam to talk about what we can do within the planning process to persuade communities to come on board to clean energy.
Yeah, so I think sort of touching on a lot of those points that were raised there, Richard. I mean, it's, again, I mentioned it a couple of times, but we know that there is public support, and you mentioned it there, for these for renewable energy, but we also know that there is wide public support for these renewable energy, these projects to be located near to people as well. On the ground, we do see objection, and I think, as Ross pointed out, it's absolutely right to allow people to object and to have those conversations with people. There's a huge amount of work still to do in that wider education piece and the wider sort of messaging as to why these projects needed. And I touched on it previously around sort of, again, needing to have much more sort of collaboration and a coherent approach to how we deliver it. And actually, people support things if they can see that there's an individual benefit for them, and we're probably not doing a good enough job at explaining what those sort of benefits are. And that's I think across all technologies. I think in the planning process, it was touched on, I think Carly touched on it, in terms of I think there isn't a one size fits all approach, particularly on the sort of DCO. We just launched with National Grid a consultation yesterday on a 180 kilometre connection project. So that's very different to a single site solar project, and there needs to be differentiation in how we go about, particularly on that sort of upfront consultation and the public consultation. We've sort of developed our own approach that we're working with on solar developers in particular, and I've sort of mentioned solar a few times, but it is the one that sort of, it is different from some of those bigger projects, and particularly the more linear projects, but what we call a solar light approach to sort of the front end consultation and engagement with people, and actually having that conversation in a different way to sort of how we've maybe been having it over the last 10, 15 years about bringing projects forward. So I think for the public and bringing them on board, it's about certainty. The delays in decision making doesn't help that at all, and I think we've seen from this government the delays to DCOs in particular have been sort of growing and growing. I think a third of the decisions from this government have been delayed, and actually, we're now seeing an increase in decisions being made by sort of political decisions being made by Secretary of State that go against the planning inspector, and again, that doesn't sort of necessarily help the certainty in the process. So I think there's definitely sort of reform needed to help speed that up and give clarity and certainty to people that this is the right approach. The strategy I think does give some green shoots into how that might come about and that change come about. But certainly, yeah, I think lots more to be done on that front.
That's great, thanks, Sam. Any further comments on sort of planning reform?
I have a couple more. Sorry, I know you want to move on. Just bear with me for a sec. So, I think one of the points I didn't make earlier is again around that education piece. So as we look at how solar is going to grow in the future, and we start to look at how local authorities are considering greenbelt land, for example, that there is a key misunderstanding in the difference between housing development and an energy generating facility, and the impacts that both have on the specific piece of land that's being taken and also the wider communities in which they operate in. And there's a my concern around this mention of brownfield relative to greenfield land is that delineation becomes absolutely nothing can be done on a greenbelt land, but things like solar are temporary. We've talked already about the biodiversity gains that you can get from a plant, so they have very different. They have an impact, but they have a very different impact to a housing estate. And I think that messaging needs to, as part of that emergency messaging we've already made, I think that needs to be communicated clearly to the decision makers within the local authorities and also to wider community as well. And finally, it's really easy as well, I think, to get very frustrated about those in the planning process. I genuinely believe, as part of trying to resolve this issue, government, central government and distributed government should be investing more heavily in supporting planning processes and the planning inspector and those in the process, to enable them to have sufficient resource, sufficient ability and technology and so on to support what they are doing to get these processes efficient. And I think they have been for a long period of time underfunded, under-resourced, and we are putting increased pressure on them as a development community as we continue to add more renewable developments into the pot, as well as new housing developments through as well. So I think there needs to be a bit of a mindset shift in terms of how we are supporting planners in actually getting to a decision point. And I'll stop talking about planning at that point, Richard, so you can move on.
That's great. Thanks, Ross. So just we've covered sort of the main technologies covered by or supported by the strategy. Next talking point, we've only got 18 minutes left, so we better be quick on this one. Should there have been stronger support for other technologies? And obviously there was a lot of discussion about onshore wind before the strategy was released, which apparently delayed the publication. There was potential for a doubling of the onshore target, but that didn't happen. There's also little mention of tidal, although it did mention aggressively pursue, I think, at one point, but there was no further information on that. So the question is, should we be doing more on other types of technologies? I think if we should start with onshore wind. Maybe Sam, if you want
happy to jump in there, Richard. I think the short answer is yes. I think that again, I said in my sort of opening remarks that although it was well publicised, the cabinet wrangling as to will they, won't they, I think it was a bit of a shock when it actually come out that what we got left with, because it doesn't really in the short term change very much, and I don't think it gives particularly England developers, onshore wind developers, certainty or confidence to bring anything forward at present. But it's very contrary to what the actual public perception is on onshore wind, and again, this overwhelming support that it is a technology that can be used and deployed cheaply, quickly, efficiently to help close the gap on sort of energy security and hitting targets. So it certainly feels like a missed opportunity. I think the detail that's in there, the language that's been used around finding sort of limited communities support. I think it's going to be an interesting to see how that actually plays out and where you sort of draw those lines in terms of what support actually looks like, and is it any different from where we are now? But I think certainly a missed opportunity to include onshore wind in this strategy.
And I mean, what there was a reference to the development of local partnerships for a limited number of supportive communities, and what I can't understand is why it would need to be a limited number. Why could it not just be any supportive communities? Clearly, there's a Tory backbench issue, but if there is that local support for schemes, whether they're obviously sub 50 megawatt at present in policy terms, but if there is that support, then why not just push them through?
I think the interesting thing on that also from a sort of onshore wind is when you look at it, I was looking at a report recently that suggests that there's sort of 239 projects, just under 6 gigawatts of onshore land onshore wind, which has been, gone through planning, consented, but hasn't been built out yet. So there's clearly other economic support that government or planet or other areas that need to fast track the process. I mean, you could say that you look at the same as a similar, a similar number for solar as well. So, as an industry, we need to look at how we can develop it. But I agree with you. Why it's only on a regionalised basis, probably plays to particular politics and the like as well that we need to manage our way around.
And then how about tidal? So there wasn't much information, but maybe a glimmer of hope about aggressively pursuing it, but not necessarily with the support that may be required for these capital intensive projects to get them started. Obviously, Swansea Tidal Lagoon was support was pulled. I think the strike price was higher than Hinkley, but of a well higher than wind, but similar to nuclear. Should we be doing more? We're in an island nation, lots of tidal power around. What's holding us back from pursuing tidal?
I think it's that long-term economic subsidy that needs to go to associated with it, isn't it? As you said, when you look at Swansea, it's a project which has been about in different forms for a fair amount of time. I think it would be interesting to see how that economic subsidy and cost would now look in the current situation, and whether people would see that as a price which is worth taking forward. I noticed on the chat there was somebody from Mersey Lagoon as well that was looking for that. So it's finding the sponsors and counterparties that can promote those projects and take them forward, but you've got to have the economic subsidy and case study in place to be able to support it. And unfortunately, there's a number of people that have been burnt by bringing those to market to date and doing that unsuccessfully. So, unless that backdrop changes, you're going to see that challenge continue for developers.
Here's this is a question from the audience, sort of a related point, actually directed to Carly, and that is, if the UK continues to rely on international partners to help finance, design and build nuclear, and perhaps read tidal there as well, how can we ensure that doesn't undermine our energy security? Sorry, Carly. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Obviously, the government have come out for nuclear and identified Great British Nuclear, I think they're going to call it. Could be a TV show in its own right, probably. So I think there is that recognition that we do need to have energy security in our own hands, but that doesn't mean we can't rely on external investors. They can go hand in hand. I think increasingly on different projects, we'll see government taking a stake in projects alongside other investors wherever they're from. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Maybe add a few bits to that as well. So look, I think the beauty of things like renewable energy is their distributed nature. So you have a robust system because you don't have single points of failure, particularly within that overall mix. So I think physically you end up with a more robust system when you rely on multiples of wind and solar and nuclear and so on that are distributed throughout geographically throughout the UK. And I think technology diversification is key as well. So no single point of failure in terms of counterparty risk or technology type risk, again just adds to that robustness. So I think the very nature of the fact that we are trying to fight this net zero battle gives us increased energy security from that distributed energy mix anyway, and that's before we start looking at interconnectors with Europe and beyond and so on, which again will hopefully feed into the mix out into the future.
Thanks for that. So just briefly, it's probably worthwhile touching upon what the strategy included in terms of North Sea oil and gas production, and a wish to sort of maximise extraction. Now, clearly, those projects will take many years to come forward. I think there's a desire to speed up that process, but I think the average time for an oil field to come to production is something like 28 years. Sort of maybe putting that to one side, is there also going to be an issue if those projects are taken forward? Will there be an issue with of diverting investments from clean energy to North Sea oil and gas, and also diverting manpower or person power, labour from clean energy projects to North Sea oil and gas, and also in the context of Europe obviously being on a fast track to clean energy too. Ross, you may have something to say on that.
Yeah, I always got something to say on most things, Richard, as you know. Look, it's not something we wanted to read. I don't think any of us wanted to see, you know, continued or advanced commitment to fossil fuels in any way, shape or form, but we get it, right? I think everybody understands that there is a transition to be had. We have to consider, you know, stability of the overall system and do whatever we can to mitigate, you know, the impact on consumer price over the midterm as well. So look, I understand that it's part of the mix. I think it would have been, the government would have left themselves very open to criticism if they hadn't included it. So I do get it. I think from a kind of a decarbonisation perspective and a flow of money perspective, ESG is at the core of every investor's mindset these days, and you can't get away from it. Greenwashing is increasingly, and greenwashing and personal hatred of mine, greenwashing is increasingly being spotlighted and called out, and I think that is really important in investors' mindset. So again, as we've said already around things like biodiversity, the way in which investors are approaching their ESG commitments and how they spend their money is improving alongside, you know, science-based targeted reporting from its underlying supply chains and investments and so on, and that will ultimately naturally creep capital away from fossil fuels into you know, newer generating sets and renewable technologies and so on. And actually society as a whole, again, is making that mindset shift. So actually we see investors very much wanting to continue to drive significant capital, significant parts of their balance sheet into renewable tech. There will obviously be some, you know, remaining investors who can find a decent return out of oil and gas.
Yeah, I suppose just adding to that, I agree that I don't think it's going to sort of limit the flow. I think, you know, resource wise, look, there's a separate industries with different resource bases. I think those are going to be set up and carry on. I think your point about what's happening elsewhere in Europe is certainly going to play in certain markets and areas. So when we look at the, you know, the offshore wind area, there is, you know, other countries across Europe now are starting to come forward and develop their offshore markets. So that is going to start putting pressure on supply chains and delivery. I think the other parts is going to come through, you know, you talk about solar, you look at the increased number, just if we work out the number of increased panels we're going to need as a consequence, you know, the manufacturing supply chain delivery piece of that to support that is absolutely critical. You know, that's in the UK, but that's happening everywhere. So that availability of key components is going to be a challenge for us as well going forward. Certainly, I think over the next 12 months, I mean, people involved in it already see there's a price point at the moment where challenges around getting access to certain materials and certain accesses at prices are at a higher level than we've seen in more recent years. So seeing that, whether that point comes, whether we can see the improvements in technology driving price and efficiency curves down, that's important for us going forward as well. I think the other points are around, you know, come back to, you know, the role of the FSO and other, you know, I think that to me is one of the key aspects, because I think I noticed in one of the chats somebody picked up about our ability as a nation, you know, what we've done with COVID and bringing forward, you know, our vaccines. Well, if this really is a once in a generational, you know, transition to net zero, then we need that type of national planning piece, and that's where that role comes into place to be able to bring together, you know, so we start bringing, forward investment required to be able to meet grid connections, to be able to meet the capacity improvements that we see. So that relationship between National Grid, the FSO, and the industry and the market development is going to be key to delivering this strategy over the next 10 years at least.
Thanks, Paul. Just picking up on one of the questions in the chat. So relating to engagement in the planning process, I think it was a point from Ross, and young people's more positive outlook on solar and wind. How do we get more young people involved in the planning process? And also, second part of the question, are we doing enough in terms of labour security to make sure young people are skilled up to work in green industries?
I'll take that first, but colleagues, please feel free to dive in after me. So I think we see a lot of positive engagement around a number of the developments that we're doing. You assume whenever you hold some form of consultation process, the people that are going to turn up are those who have particular interest in the scheme, but from a negative mindset. We really don't see that, right? We see an awful lot of positivity. We do see that from our generation and from the younger generations as well. It's very difficult to think about how you could effectively bring them into a planning process with any teeth, though we could get to a mindset that encourages people to actively support an application in a way that they currently don't really, right? You only really see people complain about applications formally, don't you? Very, very rarely see positive notes being submitted, especially in those Town and Country Planning Act focused quite fast solar developments. So I think more to be done there in terms of how we bring new people into the sector. Absolutely, again, it's a key thing that both solar and other technologies need to do more of. We do an awful lot of promotion of education and also of opening up job opportunities for local workers in the construction process and also in the long-term maintenance of assets as well. And that's across everybody's sectors within this business. I think that is key to how we drive and support the government's levelling up agenda and also how we make this more sustainable out into the future. I think, point that Paul made as well is key. What we also see is emerging technologies over the next 10, 15 years that will be fundamental. Talking again solar, you see perovskite modules coming through, which are way more efficient than what's currently in the space. Currently, that technology set focused out of Europe. What we would really like to see is support for that becoming a manufacturing base within Europe, and that the government understands the strategic importance of that supply chain and also protecting those manufacturing jobs as well. So there's definitely more that can be done in terms of continuing to support green job growth.
Yeah, I mean, as an organisation, yeah, I think we signed as a consequence to the security strategy, announced 1,000 jobs to support it. I think one of the things that Ross talked about, planning applications. When you go in, you've got to define the social value that you bring to an area in terms of jobs and supporting other levelling up agenda. So I think it beholds us on all of us in terms of bringing these projects forwards to get communities and bringing the benefits forward and showing what they can deliver.
Yeah, I think just on the young people as well, it's about engaging young people how they want to be engaged, not how we think they should be engaged, or just trying to get them involved in what the traditional planning process. So, go beyond the village hall. Unlikely to generate huge amounts of interest from young people to come to village halls, but there are ways to engage young people to be part of projects and going beyond what's just sort of the sort of core local area of where your particular development is being brought forward. And there's some great examples, particularly on the East Coast around sort of the offshore wind projects and how developers there have really gone above and beyond to engage young people in sort of education, training, skills, and opportunities of how to get involved in the sector, and really demonstrating that this is a sector, these are industries that offer really interesting and rewarding opportunities and careers for young people to get involved with. And so that, yeah, I think there's definitely some good examples. There's definitely more that can be done on other sectors as well. But yeah, I think young people are enthused, and Ross talked about young people get it. They absolutely get it, and why we need to be bringing forward all of the sort of renewable technologies and projects that we've talked about this morning. It's they that will benefit from that.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. So we've now reached 10:31. We probably could go on for another 3 or 4 hours. But yeah, it was a really useful canter through some of the detail of the strategy. Clearly, there's a lot of positivity about what's included in there. But as has been mentioned, the devil is in the detail, and there are a lot of proposals to come forward in the next year, particularly in relation to speeding up the DCO process with a fast track route, the designation of the energy MPSs, and hopefully the appearance of the nuclear MPSs or MPSs as well. And that's not even to cover the details that may come forward on the streamlining of habitat regulations and heat decarbonisation and hydrogen and tidal as well. So there's an awful lot of detail to work through. Hopefully the government will follow through, and maybe in a few years' time, all our energy costs will reduce by a few quid. So thanks very much to all the panelists today, and also thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar. The webinar is recorded and may well be put onto YouTube as well, so you'll be able to watch it over and over again. And all I've got left to say is thanks to all the panelists, and enjoy the rest of Earth Day.